February 2nd, 2009, Albuquerque, New Mexico. It began with a dog and a bone. Christine Ross was walking her dog along the West Mesa, a wide, open desert plateau on Albuquerque's western edge, when her dog began digging at the edge of a sandy wash. At first, the object looked like it could be animal bone. In the desert, that's not uncommon. But when police were called and examined the bone, they made a chilling confirmation. It was human. What followed was not a simple forensic case. It was the largest unsolved multiple homicide discovery in New Mexico history. 11 women were found buried in shallow graves scattered across the West Mesa, and later the remains of an unborn child were identified as well. These were no random deaths, they were homicides, and the question that emerged was terrifying. Who could meticulously dispose of so many women in one place and leave no arrest? To understand the mystery, we must first understand the victims. The women whose remains were recovered had something in common. They were working on the margins of society, women who struggled with addiction, many involved in street-level sex work, and some who had histories of homelessness. Their vulnerabilities were exploited. Many disappeared between March 2001 and July 2005. They were Selania Edwards, 15, runaway from Oklahoma; Michelle Valdez, 32, pregnant at the time of her death; Shauna Bradley, 19; Veronica Romero, 26; Carla Chavez, 15; Crystal Estrada, 20; Diane McCown, 21; Jessica Kirkpatrick, unknown age, and others whose identities were verified through family and dental records. These families had filed missing persons reports, in some cases years before the remains were discovered. But because the women were adults and often transient, their disappearances didn't generate immediate national headlines. In many cases, authorities treated them initially as runaways or voluntary departures. No one suspected how deeply the truth was buried. When the bones were first uncovered, investigators scrambled to understand how many remains there actually were. It didn't take long for the scope to become clear. Police teams identified 11 female bodies, 1 unborn child. They were buried in clusters scattered across a roughly 3 by 3 mile area of desert scrubland. The burial pattern suggested someone returning repeatedly to the same location, someone with familiarity with the terrain and with the knowledge that this land was seldom visited. Researchers noted that the area had been neglected due to economic conditions. Plans for development stalled after the 2008 housing market collapse, leaving the bone site undisturbed for years. It's likely the killer used this neglected desert terrain as a dumping ground precisely because it was remote but not unreachable. One of the biggest challenges for this case was what the desert had done to the bodies. After years of exposure to sun, wind, heat, and erosion, many remains were fragmented. Soft tissue was long gone. Bones showed evidence of exposure, not precise dismemberment in every case. This made it difficult to determine exact causes of death, whether trauma occurred before or after burial, whether multiple killers were involved. Secondary analysis, including dental records and DNA obtained from recovered bone fragments, made victim identification possible, but the remains themselves yielded limited evidence of a crime scene in the traditional sense. Unlike cases where trauma on bone is clear, for example, stabbing, gunshot wounds, knife marks, here the evidence was mostly absence, the absence of clarity in cause of death and the absence of a murder weapon or identifiable physical trace. This forced investigators to focus more on patterns, geography, victim profile, disappearance timelines, and witness statements from families. One name consistently emerged during task force interviews: Lorenzo Montoya, a man who lived less than 3 miles from the burial site. Montoya had a history of violent behaviour, including an attempted strangulation of a sex worker in 1999, prior suspicions from law enforcement, a threatening comment to an ex-girlfriend that he would kill her and bury her in lime. In December 2006, Montoya abducted a 19-year-old woman he met on Central Avenue a known prostitution corridor. When her boyfriend arrived to check on her, he found the woman deceased in Montoya's home. During the confrontation, Montoya was shot and killed. At the time, authorities ruled it self-defense, because Montoya was actively committing homicide against a living woman. But after the West Mesa bones were found in 2009, investigators began re-examining Montoya's violent past. Why? Because of the timeline correlation. The presumed burial period of the West Mesa victims, 2001 to 2005, stops right around when Montoya was active and alive. Furthermore, Montoya lived within a reasonable radius of the burial site. His K-noun victim profile overlapped with the women found on the mesa. The desert terrain was familiar to him. After his death, no other similar disappearance patterns continued. These factors made him a prime suspect, but not a proven one. Why? Because Montoya was already dead. And New Mexico law prohibits law enforcement from entering the DNA of someone who died without being charged into the FBI's CODIS database. That means even if Montoya's DNA was available, it couldn't legally be compared to existing victim or trace evidence without a prior charge. This legal technicality has been cited by multiple task force members as one of the biggest barriers to solving the case. While Montoya is the most often discussed suspect, he is not the only one. Another figure that surfaced in task force interviews was Joseph Blee, a convicted sex offender with a violent history and a documented pattern of predatory behavior. Investigators noted jewelry and personal effects belonging to missing women found in Blee's possession, a tree tag found near the burial site that was traced to a nursery Blee had visited. But again, no definitive forensic link, no arrest warrant, no indictment, just suspicion. Several other men were interviewed over the years, including local pimps, men with violent records involving women, individuals seen in proximity to victims before they disappeared. In each case, leads eventually stalled. Either evidence was absent, contradictory, or legally inadmissible. The West Mesa case exposed a deeper societal problem. When victims come from marginalized communities, especially women struggling with addiction or sex work, law enforcement and media attention often lag. Early missing persons reports for these women were often filed but not aggressively pursued. Coordinated multi-jurisdictional investigation came only after the remains were discovered, not when the women were alive. This has led to criticism from families and advocacy groups. Families argue early coordination could have spotted patterns. Police defenders say lack of evidence made early linkage impossible. Some investigators have admitted bias in how missing adult women cases are prioritized. This case has since become part of a broader national conversation about how missing persons cases are handled when victims are not children or affluent. Though Montoya is the most discussed suspect, investigators and forensic analysts remain cautious. The burial site lacks consistent trauma evidence linking every victim to the exact same modus operandi. This has led some experts to consider multiple killers using the same favourable burial ground, opportunistic predator behaviour amplified over years, a primary perpetrator accompanied by an accomplice. The idea is controversial, but not impossible. After all, bodies were found in at least 6 separate clusters across the mesa. Patterns exist, but they are not perfect. The West Mesa murders are not famous because of spectacle. They are chilling because of what they represent. A predator or predators who targeted vulnerable women. Systemic investigative blind spots, legal limitations that stalled forensic matches. A community left searching for answers without closure. The desert remains quiet, but the questions do not. Who killed these women? Was it Lorenzo Montoya, another known violent offender? Someone yet unidentified? The bones on the West Mesa may have been uncovered, but the truth is still buried. And until science, investigators, or conscience catches up, that truth remains hidden beneath the sand.